I have to ask you. So during your last stream, this guy Dash asked you. He said, "Don't know why the 5-year gap is a problem. Characters don't have to be in the same position. Could be in surprising places, filled in with memory and flashbacks." And he had to send you another super chat for you to
because
kind of.
I misunderstood. I misunderstood the first one. I didn't get into it, but and then we talked about it again. Yeah.
You made very good points with that, because you're right. The Ironborn can't just be doing all this reaving and raping in the Reach the entire 5-year gap. But then you brought up something else, like maybe Euron goes to do that at the last book, and in the next book, 5-year gap, somehow he's in the Summer Islands.
I guess on a real basic background, okay, so for those that don't know, George R. R. Martin, in between A Storm of Swords and, at the time it was going to be called The Dance with Dragons, it eventually became A Feast for Crows. In between his third and fourth book, George R. R. Martin originally planned on having a 5-year gap. That he planned on advancing the story 5 years. And that way, a lot of characters could age up, because he originally wanted like some romances going on with Arya and Sansa and things like that. And that way, but with 5 years, he would be able to like have everybody be doing a bunch of training that they needed to get. So like Arya, when we last see her in A Storm of Swords, she's at the she's heading off to the House of the House of Black and White. So the idea is that she would have been training at the House of Black and White for 5 years, and that way she'd be like a master assassin by the next time we see her. Daenerys and her dragons, the dragons would be big now, and she would have been ruling Meereen for 5 years. And so, I mean, you start seeing like a few of these cracks. Like, we spend now all of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons getting Arya up to speed, where we feel like she has some abilities, but she's certainly not a master of anything. Daenerys' dragons have grown really fast. And we rush her political situation. We have an entire book where she has to do the politics of Meereen. Jon would have been Lord Commander at the Wall for 5 years. And that way, he'd have the ins and outs, and there'd be issues and stuff like this, and he'd be bold enough to take certain actions. Currently in Dance with Dragons, he's pretty bold for being a new young Lord Commander. So the idea is that a few other things are a bit weird. I mean, I suppose we could advance. The idea is that Bran would be taken by Cold Hands immediately to the Cave of the Three-Eyed Crow. So Bran would be training in dreams for 5 years at this, So
the 5-year gap was supposed to be from Feast to Dance. That was the original plan?
No, the 5-year gap was between the third and fourth book. It would be from between Storm and Feast. So if you look at where the characters are at the end of Storm, it's a good resting place for most of them. Like, yes, Bran isn't at the cave, but the idea is we'd next find him at the cave, because he's last seen with Cold Hands. So he'd be training with the Three-Eyed Crow for 5 years. Arya, she doesn't actually get to the House of Black and White, but she's on the ship to go to the House of Black and White. So like, she'd be there and she'd be trained for 5 years. Dany and Jon are the clearest ones, where they're leaders, and now they're going to learn to lead for 5 years. And that's kind of a big character change, because now they can be leaders in the story versus kids.
What about Tyrion?
What they're doing. That's where we get into some of the problems. Like, what is Tyrion going to be doing for 5 years? What is Brienne going to be doing for 5 years? Yes, Cersei can be ruling the kingdom for 5 years, and Tommen can get older. Jaime can be by her side for 5 years. But then, what? A lot of it doesn't make sense. Like, is Arianne going to be, like, by Doran's side for 5 years?
What about Theon?
Like, learning... is Theon going to be... He's going to be just imprisoned, like, tortured for 5 years.
I don't think, like... So are you in favor of the 5-year gap? Like, would you be in favor had he done that?
No. I hate flash forwards for the most part. I fucking hate them for the most part. So the main reason when George finally reveals, like, why he didn't do the 5-year gap and why he thought it wasn't workable it mainly had to do with, yes, Tyrion. What do we do with, is Tyrion just going to be living at Lyrio's Manse for 5 years? Fine, maybe. But like, the big problem was the Ironborn. That when we last view Victarion, yes, Asha can be at Deepwood Mott for 5 years, fine. But what do you do with Aeron and Victarion and Euron for 5 years? Are the Ironborn going to be raiding the Reach for 5 years? Is Victarion going to be traveling to Slaver's Bay for 5 years? And so this is why George ultimately did not go with the 5 year gap. Like, a few of them don't work. Like Brienne, is Brienne going to be searching for Sansa, like wandering around for 5 years? It's all a bit weird when you start thinking about other characters. Like, certain characters are in a perfect position to sit for 5 years. Arya, Daenerys, Jon. Like, Stannis was going to be at the Wall for 5 years. Like, it's crazy stuff when you think about it.
I would argue even Sansa / Elaine would be in a nice position as well, because what just happened?
Yeah.
Littlefinger just killed Lysa, so he is kind of ruling as regent, and Sansa is just learning under him.
It's the main reason, and yes, Brienne, Tyrion were tough to deal with, but the main one was what do you do with Vic? What do you do with Victarion and Aeron for 5 years? I mean, Aeron leading a resistance movement for 5 years, maybe on the Iron Islands. But really, can Euron be raiding the Reach for 5 years and Victarion be traveling to find Dany for 5 years? And so the point that Dash of Biter put forward was, yeah, that seems like a problem, but it's not really a problem. So the problem with flashbacks, and I agree with this in general, and why I hate them, is that we've had a bunch of action with these characters, and then they all of a sudden go static for 5 years, which seems really weird. Because how often do characters go static and do the same thing for 5 years? And so most of the time when you see a flashback, it sucks because you're like, oh, come on, like nothing else happened. But what Dash of Biter was saying was, you don't need to do that. You can do the 5 year gap and then have Victarion have a whole bunch of different adventures. Like, maybe he ran into the Summer Islands and then lost his ships, and then like had to gain more ships and ended up in Volantis, and then had this and this adventure happen, and this adventure happen, and that can all be visited in flashbacks. Like, you don't need to have a static, stay in place for 5 years situation with a gap. You can have a whole bunch of like dynamic, crazy things happen to characters. You just have to like plot it out. And he is right. One could do that. Writers rarely do, but you could do that, So yeah.
I don't know if I'd be okay with a 5 year gap. Maybe a 1 or 2 year, sure, but 5 years, that's a bit much.
Yeah. I agree. So instead, like George went the reverse and went no gap at all. And you immediately like get into, and we waste so much time of like Cersei dealing with like, Tywin's death and preparing for his funeral and burning the Tower of the Hand and learning to rule, and immediately, almost too quickly, trying to take down the Tyrells. And I remember reading A Feast for Crows thinking, oh my God, like, we just had the War of the Five Kings and people are like immediately wanting to go to war again. Like, it was like when I was reading the Arianne chapters, I was like, what? Really? Like, we just dealt with like 3 books of just blood and war. And like the same with like Cersei, like, have a breather. Like, you can't just go immediately to war with the Tyrells. Like, you can't do that. Like, this was my thinking when I read A Feast for Crows for the first time, that it was all happening too fast. So I do think George kind of goes the other way too much. Like, I think you're right, Carmine. I think there should have been a 6-month gap, a 1 year gap, something.
Well, if you're gonna do 5 years after, like, Storm of Swords, I'm sure you already know this. If the audience doesn't know this, is lauded as like the best Ice and Fire book. You go from like a great Ice and Fire book, and everybody's like anxiously anticipating the next one where they want to continue off, and all of a sudden everyone's in different places. That would piss a lot of people off. That would piss a lot of people. Like, come on. No. Yeah.
And there was one of the big things as well is when George started the book again, Ben, his editor didn't have too many notes, but one of the notes she had was, yeah, I understand, like, the characters, like, this all happened yesterday for the characters, but for we the readers, it's been 6 years. And so to us, like John, our immediate assumption is that, like, John's been Lord Commander for a while. So you need to sum things up and remind us that was yesterday, you know? And so he does. He goes back and he, like, adds extra fluff to some of the chapters, like reintroducing the setting, specifically with John and Bran and stuff like that. Like, how did they get in this situation? Oh, right. You know, Bran went to the Night Fort and then met Cold Hands, and okay, let's reestablish that and then go forward. So there's a lot of that summary at the beginning of A Dance with Dragons.
The problem you also encounter, this, as someone who reads manga and watches anime, this is something that happens a lot in this in these mediums. Where, take One Piece, for example. They did a whole 2-year time skip. Now, the purpose of One Piece is for this character to find the One Piece, but there are other big players all over the world who are also trying to find the One Piece. He goes through the big war. He feels defeated. He realizes he needs to train. So for 2 years, he trains. After the 2-year time skip, he gathers his crew and sets out to find the One Piece. The moment this motherfucker gathers his crew again after 2 years to set out to find the One Piece, all the big players around him start to move as well. What the fuck were they doing in those past 2 years? Why does all of a sudden the story happen now when the main character moves?
It's such a massive coincidence, right? It's such a massive coincidence. Mm-hmm. Like, you never have a situation where it's always like the gang gets back together again, right? You never have a situation like, you know, in real life, think about your friends. Like there's some friends you lose contact with and you get back together, and there's some friends that you never see again, and there's some friends you hang out with continuously and whatever. But, like, very rarely is it you all break up and then you all get back together like simultaneously and pick up the story from where it, like, we last left it like a couple years ago. You know, it's too neat, right, to have these, like, gaps in store with time skips. So yeah.
Like, how do you all of it? Yeah, too much coincidence. What, the story only picks up now when a certain character does something? Then that way now it's a domino effect that all the characters now have to start moving into certain positions. That's kind of dumb. And like I said, you do the 5-year time skip, people are going to be upset. Like, they really wanted to know what happened after this event happened, and now that's nowhere near where the story is. There's new characters. It's a mess.